So welcome everyone to this invitation-only event to discuss issues that are and should be top of mind for non-executive directors around the country. Today's session is based on a topic from the Directors Colloquium, the course for directors of listed companies presented by AGSM in conjunction with the Business Council of Australia and King & Wood Mallesons. The colloquium commenced in 2019 with an extremely successful launch and will run once again in November this year. The colloquium is an opportunity for non-executive directors of Australia's largest listed companies to come together in a closed-door Chatham House rules environment to discuss topics that are of significant importance to them and to their boards. 10 cases have been written that underpin and are exclusive to the colloquium and span companies such as CBA, AMP, Storm Financial, Qantas, BHP, Glencore and Origin. Today is just a small sample of what we will discuss at the colloquium. Ever since mid-2018, when APRA released a seminal report into CBA, Australia's corporate community, especially the financial services sector, has been forced to respond to constant regulatory focus on management and accountability of non-financial risks, including all of the C's: culture, conduct, compliance, climate change, and cybersecurity. This has been evidenced most recently by the release by Westpac of a reassessment of its culture, governance, and accountability plan. Today, we'll examine the issues for Australian business, the intervention of regulators into this area, the consequences for managers who are held accountable for risk failures. Let me kick off with some introductions. First of all, I'm Dr. Jeffrey Tobias, and I'm the Program Director for the Directors Colloquium. I'm the founder of the Strategy Group, where we focus on innovation, the customer and employee experience, and transformation of business models. We work with large and medium-sized companies across a diverse range of verticals, and many of you online this morning are non-executive directors of our clients. I'm also adjunct professor and fellow at the Australian Graduate School of Management, of which I'm very proud, and I'm involved in every aspect of the MBA at AGSM. Can I please introduce Tim Bednall? Tim is a partner of King & Wood Mallesons who practices in mergers and acquisitions, capital markets, corporate governance, and Tim advises ASX 100 corporations and government enterprises. Tim was chairman of the Australian Partnership of King & Wood Mallesons from January 2010 to December 2012, during which time the combination between King & Wood and Mallesons Stephen Jacques was negotiated and implemented. He was also managing partner of M&A and Tax for KWM Europe and Middle East from 2016 to 2017. He now leads the KWM corporate governance practice, and I have thoroughly enjoyed the past 18 months under Tim's guidance to deliver the Directors Colloquium. Tim is also a member of the Corporations Committee of the Law Council of Australia and a member of the National Portrait Gallery Foundation Board. Tim was adjunct faculty member of the University of Sydney Law Faculty, won't hold it against you, Tim, from 1997 to 2014, and has published a number of journal articles on directors' duties. I'd like to introduce Nicola Wakefield Evans. Nicola is an independent non-executive director of the Lendlease Group, Macquarie Group, Macquarie Bank, NameMetLife Australia, and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and the chair of the 30% Club Australia. She's also on the national board of the Australian Institute of Companies Directors, the board of the UNSW Foundation, and the Go Foundation, and a member of the Takeovers panel. Nicola is an M&A and equity capital markets lawyer and spent nearly 30 years at King & Wood Mallesons, 20 years as a partner. Nicola was involved in a number of significant and groundbreaking M&A transactions and has advised some of the largest companies in Australia, Asia, and globally. Nicola also had several key management roles at King & Wood Mallesons, including managing partner, international for Hong Kong, and has lived and worked in Sydney, Perth, Melbourne, New York, and Hong Kong. Nicola is a fellow of AICD and a member of Chief Executive Women. So welcome, Tim and Nicola, and all of you to this discussion this morning, this taste of the Directors Colloquium. A bit of process for today. Shortly, I'll hand over to Tim, who'll start the conversation with Nicola. Please feel free to ask questions via the Q&A, and we'll endeavour as we go to answer them. If we run out of time, we'll answer the questions with a follow-up. Just as a note, we're recording the session for posterity. However, happy to remove any of the questions from the recording. Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you for that very kind invitation. I will now try and share the screen, and fingers crossed that this all works well. I think it's worked. So, today we're going to talk about management accountability for non-financial risks. And it's fair to say that the landscape in Australia in this area has changed completely over the last 3 years. And we've had a number of touch points that have indicated that change. First, the Financial Services Royal Commission, in which the Commission looked at financial services entities meeting community standards and expectations rather than black letter law and regulation, asking the question, not can we, but should we. Around about the same time in 2018, APRA published its seminal report into CBA, which we will come back to in this presentation this morning. That prompted all APRA-regulated entities to undertake a self-assessment and publish a culture, governance and accountability report, or prepare one. Some published, some didn't. The focus of the management of non-financial risks is, as Jeffrey has mentioned, on the 5 C's: culture, conduct, compliance, climate change and cybersecurity. And we'll come back to each of these as well through the course of today's presentation. All of this leads to a new expectation of accountability. It's become an overriding political and regulatory expectation of directors and senior managers that they be accountable for the behaviour of their corporations. This has been enforced by far more aggressive regulatory activity. ASIC's mantra, why not litigate? And we're seeing that in spades. APRA, under the Bank Executive Accountability Regime, has been forced to become a conduct monitor, a role that it's not had before. And we've seen AUSTRAC seeking scalps, possibly not solutions, although they would no doubt argue about that. Just to top it all off, for those provisions of the Corporations Act that involve dishonesty, we have a new definition of dishonesty. It means dishonest according to the standards of ordinary people. No longer is it necessary for ASIC to prove any subjective element or intent in relation to dishonest conduct. So that sets the scene. And for the next couple of slides, Nicola is just going to walk us through the things that have changed from the board's perspective in relation to management accountability in this area of non-financial risk. Nicola, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. I think it's fair to say that since the Financial Services Royal Commission and the APRA-CBA report, listed companies have and boards have worked substantially around reframing how they look at risk. Non-financial risk emerged during the Financial Services Commission as, I think, the touch point for boards and a real wake-up call around accountability. I think it's fair to say that most boards in the ASX, at least in the ASX 200, have substantially rethought a couple of things, the way that they look at non-financial risk, the way that non-financial risk issues is dealt with within their organisations, and who is accountable for non-financial risk. And several things have happened. I've observed, particularly in the companies I'm involved in, but also talking to a lot of my colleagues, that the board risk committees have been substantially revamped. So boards have dusted off their risk appetite statements and their risk management frameworks and really had a deep dive into how risk is escalated up to a board. And I think that's been noted by both APRA for the financial services institutions, but also ASIC has commented that that's what they're seeing in the work that they're doing. There's been a substantial amount of work around who is accountable for non-financial risk failures and making sure that the 3 lines of defence are working properly. So really looking at the first line and their accountability, and then the controls and assurance processes that companies have in place to look at non-financial risk. I think the standing and authority of responsible risk managers has been increased, and my observation will be has been that if corporate risk executives weren't reporting to the board, to the CEO, they now are, and they now have a direct line to the chair of the risk committee or the audit and risk committee. Most big companies have rethought the way that they do compliance, and in fact, when you talk to heads of compliance across the ASX 50, one of the areas they're really struggling with finding competent people to work is in the compliance space. It's just been an explosion of jobs in compliance. And senior risk positions have been created specially to manage financial crime, environmental and cybersecurity risks. I talked about the 3 lines of defence, and I think up until the Financial Services Royal Commission, my observation, both as a lawyer and also as a non-executive director, was a lot of companies put in a 3 lines of defence model but didn't make it real. And you know, I've been on boards where there's been a muddling of responsibility between the first and the second line, or there's been no accountability taken by the first line, so the second line's had to do it. That, I think, is completely changing, and if it's not, it should be. And companies need to make sure that they're making the 3 lines of defence model real and not theoretical. And that means that you need to have proper training of the first line to understand their accountability and what they're guarding against. The second line, or the risk management staff, must have an appropriate level of expertise and authority, and I would also say seniority in an organisation, so that they can make their assurance and controls appropriate and effective. And the third line, internal audit, must be taken seriously. And I think my observation would be that the CBA APRA report really demonstrated that boards need to have a lot more involvement in the reports that are being done by internal audit, and of course having red flag reports reaching the board. And then the next thing that's been, in my view, substantially reworked is accountability through the remuneration process. Boards have taken a new, tougher approach to remuneration, and have really rethought accountability. Managers with responsibilities under the new risk management structures are being made accountable and are having their remuneration affected if there are issues within their organisation. So failures to manage non-financial risks have resulted in significant loss of variable remuneration. And I've observed this before and publicly, that companies that have had safety as a huge issue have always, have mostly had accountability in their REM for safety failures, and they're using those models to now move right across the whole spectrum of non-financial risk. Guidelines have been developed for adjustment of remuneration for non-financial risk, led by the European Financial Stability Board, and a lot of Australia's big company boards are now taking notice of what those guidelines are saying. Conduct gateways have led to a total forfeiture of variable REM in some cases. And of course, APRA has proposed that 50% of variable REM should be assessed against the management of non-financial risk. But they have stepped back on this, but I actually think that we'll see more discussion around this in the future.
Thanks very much, Nicola. So for the next few minutes, we're going to revisit APRA'S CBA report. As I said at the outset, this was the seminal report that really set the tone, I think much more so even than the Financial Services Royal Commission, in affecting behaviour of major corporations in relation to the management of non-financial risk and the accountability of management for that risk. The report covered a number of themes that are here on this slide, but I'll jump straight into it. The role of the board. This was groundbreaking for a regulator to step in, examine in the detail that it did the operation of the board of our largest company, and to report in a way that was so critical but incisively so. And this slide really summarises the findings of APRA. The board didn't have visibility, there was no urgency, there was a tone of inaction that infected the rest of the bank. There was a static agenda, infrequent meetings between the chair and the CEO, a lack of challenge by the board, and a failure to respond to red flag issues, in particular relating to anti-money laundering, that had been raised by internal audit over a 3-year period. There were gaps in reporting metrics that hampered the effectiveness of the board, and we'll come back to this. One of the big issues is how you ensure that information flows up to the board. So on customers, the board didn't receive information on complaints. The Net Promoter Score was a score that CBA did well at, and so when it came to customers, the board saw CBA coming first on NPS. What that disguised was, in one 12-month period that APRA examined, 885,000 customer complaints. We'll come back to this, but the board didn't see that. There was poor risk reporting. We've talked about the failure to respond to red flag issues. There was no follow-up or closure of those issues, and information was filtered. The board didn't get to it. The view was that the real meetings happened outside the board meeting or the ExCo meetings. There was a lack of candour from management, and this is a real issue. How can boards ensure that bad news travels upwards? APRA suggested that boards start dealing directly with operational level employees. In other words, having a direct line of communication through to anti-money laundering officers, compliance officers, cybersecurity staff, to verify messaging that they were receiving from senior executives. I'm not sure if that's sensible. Nicola, do you have a view on that recommendation?
I think the way that boards have actually dealt with that recommendation is looking at their risk committees and the remit of how reports have gone to the risk committees. And a number of companies have actually established a new committee. So I think Suncorp established a customer committee. Macquarie has a compliance, board governance and compliance committee, which I chair. Most of the banks now have a separate committee that's sort of morphing into dealing with non-financial risks, and are having the relevant officers report to those committees. So I think while when this suggestion came out, there was a lot of commentary around, you're just making the work of the boards untenable. Most companies have actually thought through how to deal with this effectively and how to make sure that these issues are coming up. So it's not uncommon now to have the head of compliance, the head of either IT or separate cybersecurity officers, which are now being appointed, heads of security, heads of customer or voice of customer, the customer advocates coming to the board. So I think it's sort of it's worked out, but different companies have done different things.
So could I just ask a question here? So we have on the slide, how can boards ensure that bad news travels upwards? Do you think it should be even significantly stronger than that? So the customer's front and centre for the board, not only hearing bad news or good news, but actually determining the direction that management should take around the customer, much in the way as Jeff Bezos and the board at Amazon do, for example.
I actually have a strong view about that, and I know that other directors in the community don't necessarily agree with me, but I do think that in organisations where that rely on customers, boards have to have much more visibility around customers, customer complaints, customer metrics like all the scores that people get, what customers are actually saying, bad and good, about an organisation. It's actually not hard to get those reports to the board. On your second point, Jeff, I think the issue around bad news travelling is a cultural issue within organisations. And the boards need to sort of be the culture warrior of companies now. And I think that's absolutely clear from expectations from stakeholders. But you need to make sure that there is a culture within organisations that bad news, however bad, needs to be brought up the line. You can't have it stopping. I think in the CBA APRA report, there's a suggestion that there were blockages at every step of the way for bad news travelling up to the board. You need to make sure that those are removed. And how boards do that is actually the harder point of this. How do boards actually delve into their organisations to make sure that the culture settings are right, that the accountability settings are right, that employees are encouraged to speak out if there's bad news, and that means that you've got to have proper whistleblowing policies. It's a whole end-to-end game, and you have to make sure that all the settings are right.
Thank you. And it's very, very difficult, particularly with this increased emphasis on personal accountability.
It is, absolutely.
Where people are looking to cover their own position first and foremost, which is leading to I think the risk of achieving exactly the opposite effect of what accountability is supposed to achieve.
Yeah.
Just to finish on this slide, APRA was particularly critical of the hubris around the CBA. The CBA rated its own board audit committee as world-class, and clearly APRA didn't think it was. So this was a really hard-hitting report. I'll skip through these. They're really just similar conclusions from APRA on fundamental defects in the governance structures at CBA. The recommendations that APRA had for the board, firstly, to increase visibility, and this phrase, a tone at the top. And really this phrase has become one of those sort of jargon phrases really in governance speak, setting the tone at the top, and it's come from this report. Adopting better processes and practices for risk management, that was self-evident from the conclusions in the report. Proper coordination between board committees. So the REM committee needs to know where the risk committee has found risk failures in order to properly assess the REM. Direct communication with business units, we've just spoken about that, and making sure that we receive adequate information about non-financial risks in particular. I should say there was no criticism of the level of risk management of financial risks within CBA, which is exactly as you'd expect. It was this area of non-financial risk where things started to fall down. So some questions about board performance, and Nicola, will come back to you again to respond to some of these questions. How do boards become visible in their organisation when they only meet 3 days a month? How can you inculcate a culture across an organisation as large as CBA? And do you agree with Ken Henry, who said that cultural change at NAB will take 10 years? Thoughts?
So I don't agree with Ken. I think if there's a culture problem in an organisation, it's the board's responsibility to fix it. And part of the visibility question goes to how the board engages with the business. And again, if I take the safety example, companies that have safety as a huge priority. So construction companies, transport companies, heavy manufacturing, engineering companies have had a system in place for many years where the board does site visits. And the positive impact of site visits is that you see employees, you're actually watching the business in action, you're talking to stakeholders. So you're not sitting in the boardroom, you're out there within the business. And I think all boards need to do that. You can't just sit in a boardroom 3 days a month or 3 days every second month and even attempt to understand how a business operates. So I think I think what we've seen is a big emphasis on boards getting out and visiting the business. That's the first thing. The second thing is I think boards need to relook at a company's purpose and its guiding principles, what drives the company, and understand whether that's effective and whether employees understand what the company's purpose is. And my observation, and Jeffrey, you've probably seen this in the work you do, a lot of companies, a lot of boards are insisting that the purpose work be redone or refreshed so that work is filtering both up and down within organisations. And I think that's an effective barometer of testing the culture and the behaviour within an organisation. Boards shouldn't be visible when things go wrong. Boards need to be there. The companies and their employees and executives need to know who their boards are and need to have visibility, I think, across many different areas. I mean, on one of my boards, each director sponsors a different component of the business. So you'll have somebody who works on the diversity, so works with the team around diversity initiatives, meets with senior female executives. You'll have another board member who perhaps will work with the finance team to make sure that you're pushing down the accountability lens. You'll have other directors who are responsible for the safety audits, other directors who are working closely with the ESG team, for example. So I think boards are critically looking at how they can change the way in which they can get that visibility across a business.
Okay. We've touched on the themes from the next couple of points on this slide, but do you have any observation as to whether this increase in challenge by directors interrogating managers directly by the board, what impact that's having on the CEO's role and the authority of the CEO?
Look, I would say, to be honest, it's been hard. And part of that is all of a sudden, I think, directors have realised that they need to be a lot more involved in board meetings. So you've seen that really good piece of work that the Governance Council and ARCD did on company minutes, which is something, people take for granted. But in fact, the regulators were looking at our company minutes, and this came out in the Financial Services Royal Commission, and just saying, well, you don't do anything. These are cursory at best, or testing directors who were alleging that they were raising things but they weren't in the minutes. So I think there's been a whole piece of work around how do boards operate, how much time do you spend on various matters, and properly reflecting the discussion. Where I've seen a lot of debate is, in fact, senior executive teams, CEOs and senior executive teams not fully understanding the role of the board. So there needs to be an education process both ways. Executive teams and CEOs need to understand exactly what's driving this change in behaviour by directors. Why are directors commenting, being a lot more critical, and forcibly reshaping remuneration, for example. And in the financial services sector, the directors also have their accountability. So we're accountable like the executives. So we are obviously going to step up and take that responsibility seriously.
And then final question on this slide. How do you get the right amount of information, particularly this time of year? board packs are heading up towards 2,000 pages. It's almost impossible to digest 2,000 pages for a board meeting when you're a part-time non-executive director. Where do you strike the balance? How do you strike the balance?
This is the most vexed question in this whole debate, Tim. And you're absolutely right. And also, if you look at the fact that you normally get less than a week to read, in a board cycle, you could conceivably get upwards of 1,500 pages on your iPads. It is impossible. And I think what I'm seeing, and certainly in the boards I'm involved in, there have been board subcommittees formed specifically for this purpose to work with the management team to make sure that we are getting the right information, but also the information's coming to us properly on iPads, because I think when we went to Diligent and those other methods, people were just photocopying the old style of board papers and plonking them on Diligent. My observation has been that there's been a lot more really good work, and the Governance Institute and the Company Secretaries Group, I think, are doing some really good work in looking at how information comes to the board, who manages the flow, does it, how tightly controlled is it, and how can you ask the question, how can you make sure you're getting the right information and not just a lot of information that people want to give you. So those conversations, there will be a change. In my view, there will be a substantial change in the flow and the type of information that boards are seeing, particularly precisely for this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, could I just add to that? So I'm also on the board of a number of startups, and startups are traveling as fast as they possibly can, and the CEO often complains about, I've got to take out time from the business to prepare the board pack and so on. And I'll often say to the CEO, look, the board pack is primarily for you. It's for you as the management team to sit back and distill the information, what's happened over the past while. Make sure that you're across the information yourself. So yes, the information is coming to the board. That's great for the board. But one view is it's actually even more important for the management team to prepare that board pack to actually realise what's happening in the business themselves.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So moving from the board to the senior executive group at CBA, APRA concluded that the executive committee wasn't effective for addressing group-wide risks. In other words, there was no sense of collective accountability, and individual accountabilities didn't cover the group-wide risks, and anti-money laundering was a prime example. There was also a reluctance to interfere in other people's areas of responsibility, a siloed culture in which you didn't try to tell someone else how to do their job, basically. And this resulted in decision-making being delayed, obfuscated. Apart from AML, the other example that APRA cited was that it took 5 years to stop mis-selling of credit card insurance after it was first identified as an issue by the bank. So the recommendation from APRA was to embed collective accountability for management of the group. My observation here is that is directly contrary to the individual or siloed accountability that we've now got under the bank executive accountability regime. And I don't know how to reconcile those two things. Clearly, collective accountability is desirable in an organisation, in any organisation amongst the senior executive team, but we've now got a law that allocates individual accountabilities, very rarely joint, to particular senior executives under the BEAR. The other recommendation, which is consistent with the sort of things we've been talking about, was to elevate the head of compliance to the ExCo. I'm not sure that that has in fact happened at CBA, but the head of compliance is under the Banking Act statutorily caught by the BEAR regime. So whether they're on ExCo or not, they're directly accountable to APRA.
So Tim, if I could just make a comment here, I think your point in the second last dot point is right, but I think the way that companies, particularly financial services companies, have reconciled, because you're right, there's a tension with what APRA wants to do and what the BEAR regime set up to do. the way I would observe that financial services company are dealing with this is to go back to the 3 lines of defence and to really make sure that you've got the first and the second lines working properly, but also that you've got the controls in place. And if you have the right controls and assurance frameworks in place, you sort of get there through that, you get that collective accountability, notwithstanding the bare accountability responsibilities. So I think that's where companies have tried to manage that tension.
Yeah.
So I have a question here. So with respect to BEAR, the question is, how is it applied in the UK? The comment is they've been dealing with this issue for a number of years. Any comments about how it's been applied in the UK?
Perhaps I'll take that. The senior manager regime in the UK, the questioner is right, has been in place for quite a lot longer than we have had the BEAR in Australia. It's also far more broad-based, and it's now in the process of being rolled out so that it applies right across the regulated or licensed financial services sector. Here, at present, BEAR only applies to banks, to ADIs. The regime in the UK is also, how can I put this, more gently managed, I suppose, is the best way of describing it. It's certainly been pervasive. It is also managed by 2 regulators, the Prudential Regulatory Authority and the FCA. There is I guess, some issues there, and we're about to face those with ASIC becoming joint regulator under BEAR and under its replacement, the FAR, which we'll come to later. I do think we can learn from the UK. The BEAR followed the UK, but there are some, very specific differences between the BEAR and the UK arrangement. And one of them, from a legal perspective, is that where you've got joint accountability under the BEAR, so for instance, 2 people responsible for some sort of tech issue that applies to both a direct business line and the IT function. Each of the 2 executives who are jointly accountable for that particular matter are also jointly liable. So if the other stuffs up, if one stuffs up, the other is responsible for that stuff up. That doesn't happen under the senior manager regime in the UK. It's one of the things that I think we should fix. But yes, we've got a lot to learn, and I think the regulatory experience in the implementation of the senior management regime is something that I hope APRA and ASIC continue to learn from. Nicola, did you have a comment on that?
I agree with that, because I sit on a board where we're both subject to the SMR regime, not the board, I would say, but our UK business. And of course, we're subject to BEAR. And my observation would be that when the SMR regime came in, it actually had a hugely positive impact on our UK and European business, because it made the accountability line very clear. It didn't have that big stick approach that the BEAR regime had, and you're absolutely right about the dual accountability. That's actually very hard to manage. And what I think in practice is happening is the ADIs are trying to avoid those dual hat responsibilities, and there's been a lot of discussion with APRA, and the way that APRA is trying to deal with it is to persuade the ADIs not to have dual hatted responsibilities, because it is really hard and it's unfair. And it doesn't work it doesn't happen under the SMR regime. The SMR regime, I think, is better at making sure that you set out the responsibility. So with accountability comes responsibility, but also what is the job description of the person who has the accountability? I think that's much better managed under the SMR regime than it is under the BEAR regime.
Yeah, I agree. So a few of the issues with the CBA management. Internal audit, again, an average of 275 days to resolve an issue, 39% of issues open for over 2 years. Just coming back to the customer complaints stuff, this stuff did not get to the board. CBA had a top-ranking Net Promoter Score. Management selected 2 issues a month for the board report. And so in the year that APRA looked at, as I mentioned earlier, there were 885 1,000 customer complaints, only 3.4% of those complaints were reviewed for systemic issues, and that review disclosed 250 systemic issues within the customer service arrangements at CBA. None of that got to the board.
That's an area, Tim, that has changed. I can say that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's a lot more visible customer reporting. And the good thing about customer reporting, going back to the length of board paper issues, this is something that you can do statistically and in a tabular format, and that really shows the story, and just, you know, working with the team to make sure that the board is getting the right level of information.
Yeah, and I think that the Royal Commission was also a big factor on this in making boards look at the customer first and reconciling this sort of, we'll come to it, but looking after the customer didn't necessarily mean you weren't looking after the shareholder, and in fact those things over time should coalesce. APRA identified a number of examples in their report about this issue of things falling between the cracks, and anti-money laundering was the worst example. And of course, there was proceedings against CBA running at the same time. So this exchange of emails between two senior executives, I just don't think that Senior Executive Y feels that they were accountable for AML in their business unit for all those years. And Senior Executive Y shoots back, I wasn't, that was your accountability. This was a prime example of where things fell down. The other thing that was observed by APRA in relation to CBA is that there were virtually no consequences for REM. So in this year, 2016-17, where there were known major, I think there were 5 major risk management failures, including AML, the maximum reduction of STI targets was 10%. That, as we saw, was later increased to 100%. I think there were 2 years in a row where the CBA variable REM was awarded at 0. Accompanying this was what APRA observed to be inadequate board oversight and challenge to REM. No evidence that the REM committee considered making risk adjustments to deferred REM for AML. And I think Nicola's just made this comment, but you can be confident that that is not happening in 2020. So the world has really changed. We've had a significant change in the way in which risk and REM really work together, and people are truly held to be accountable. And
the thing that we need to now look at is to see whether that's been effective, Tim. Whether the complete sea change on the board's approach to REM and accountability and non-financial risk has led to positive change within organisations around the management of non-financial risk. And that's still to play out, I think.
Yeah. So these are the 9 cultural shortcomings that APRA observed. I should say that we'll be making these slides available, so to the extent that we're flicking through them quite quickly, you'll be able to pick them up later. And I think we've covered most of these points as we've talked through that report.
So Tim, I have a question around committees. So the question is, why don't we have standalone reputational risk committees? The issue seems to get lost under non-financial risk. And so there's a real risk that the fundamental question, yes, we can do this from the various risk points of view, but should we do it, gets insufficient attention.
So, Jeffrey, I could make a comment there, because the way I think that's now being managed by boards is to have, and they're called different things, but I'll use one that one of my boards does. Major material decisions are put through an ethical filter lens, and that's supposed to pick up. So if it, and it doesn't matter if it's deciding to do a project or making a decision, for example, to accept JobKeeper, you are applying an ethical filter. And the reason for putting that filter in place, and it doesn't need to be, ethical might not be the right word, but what boards are insisting that the management teams do is to actually look at the potential reputation damage in making a decision. And it covers a wide range of things, including making executive appointments. If you're going to make an executive appointment, is there a potential reputation issue? And there's one playing out very visibly in the market today, where you could question whether that board made an executive appointment applying those principles. I think there's a call every time there's an issue, a major corporate issue. There's a call to add another committee to a board. I think the better thing, and certainly I have made a comment that boards are adding compliance committees, for example, or customer committees. But at some point, the board's cadence and the way we operate, you couldn't operate with too many committees, because you'd run into the problem that Tim's already outlined, which is how do you do the reporting up from a committee to the board and across committees? It just becomes hard. So you've got to look at how material decisions are made and their impact on reputation, potential impact on reputation.
Thank you.
Okay, so leaving APRA's reporting to CBA and turning to the Financial Services Royal Commission, and really this is really helping to build up what's happened over the last few years to get to where we are today. But the main findings that came out of the Hayne Royal Commission, which really focused on retail markets and dealing with retail customers. The Financial Services Royal Commission's main findings: culture, governance and remuneration must focus on non-financial risks as well as financial risk. So this was part of this turning point with APRA and CBA and with the Royal Commission. And this fundamental finding that failings of organisational culture, governance arrangements and REM systems lie at the heart of much of the misconduct examined by this commission. The rest of this slide really emphasises what came out of the CBA report: active oversight, interests of customers, following up red flag items, but this interesting conclusion that culture cannot be prescribed or regulated. So we've got a focus of the regulators, but Hayne is saying you can't actually regulate this stuff. You need to establish your own culture. And this is going back to what Nikki was talking about, resetting the company's purpose, making sure that it's focused to the current challenges that the company faces. APRA will assess the culture of regulated entities, including cultural drivers of misconduct as part of its role as the prudential regulator, but actually establishing the corporate culture itself. There's no one size fits all, that's obvious.
So the best example in this space, Tim, is actually not an Australian example. It's the Wells Fargo example, where the board never visited any branches, but they were getting quite comprehensive reports on the culture of Wells Fargo, which, you know, in the US had a very special place and was a highly successful company. But because of that lack of board over, actually visiting branches and talking to staff, they couldn't assess themselves the culture of Wells Fargo. So they were just believing what they were told without assessing the evidence themselves. And I think that's all that example and what happened at Wells Fargo should be a lesson to everybody around the absolute importance of understanding, but also visiting your businesses.
Yep. So following the APRA report into CBA and the Royal Commission, all APRA-regulated entities were asked to prepare a self-assessment on culture, governance and accountability, which they did, and they submitted to APRA. NAB was the only major bank, in fact, only major corporation to publish its self-assessment in 2018. These assessments were given to APRA in November, December 2018.
Can I just make a comment there, Tim, because a lot said about that, but the way that the self-reporting was done, it was initially set up to be a dialogue between APRA and the ADI. And a lot of the reports were done on the basis that they wouldn't be published, and then it was too hard to retrofit them at the end for publishing. So that's why you get this issue where NAB was the only one, because I think they decided to take the time to redid their report to make it publishable.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't meaning, it was just an observation. Having assisted in the preparation of others of these self-assessments, yes, they were not meant to be published. The NAB'S self-assessment really echoed a lot of the things that came out of the CBA report. The management of compliance and conduct risk wasn't robust or effective. Leaders weren't clear enough on who was accountable. The remuneration and performance management didn't sanction poor behaviour, or interestingly, this observation properly reward good behaviour either. There's two sides to this coin. And the board and senior executives weren't challenging enough. And really you see this playing out, and we see it being addressed by boards and senior management across the country. WESTPAC, interestingly, published a self-assessment in mid-2019 before the AUSTRAC proceedings commenced, which have had a huge impact on that organisation. WESTPAC's self-assessment was less harsh than NAB'S, but interestingly, WESTPAC undertook a reassessment, encouraged by APRA to do so, and published the reassessment in just last month. It had three principal conclusions, and I'll really just look at the first of those. And these are observations that are not consistent necessarily with other organisations, but again, a theme that resonates. The organisational construct created complexity, and complexity creates its own problems. And so it was almost deliberately complex. That the bank was immature and had an immature and reactive risk culture for non-financial risk management. Three lines of defence model wasn't well understood or embedded, and that was particularly in the first line. So these are the areas where customer fronting staff. A shortfall in non-financial risk management capability. This is a theme that Nicola was speaking to at the outset. That is, you need proper expertise, proper authority, proper seniority in your risk management capability, the second line. And for WESTPAC, challenges in execution and staying the course. And this is a particular issue that had been identified earlier by WESTPAC, that in their own view, they weren't good at executing. So they'd set themselves a task, but wouldn't execute it well or in a timely way. And these are things which John McFarlane in particular is really focusing on to improve the execution capability of the organisation. Very interesting, particularly in the face of all of the challenges that WESTPAC's facing in the AUSTRAC proceedings. The other areas in this reassessment, we're going back to root causes, and these root causes are quite common, and then looked at sort of what had happened between the 2018 self-assessment and where they got to, and they're really going back and not quite starting again, but picking up areas where the implementation of the 2018 self-assessment had not been as effective as it should have been. And so their new program, they've established 3 pillars: direction and tone set by the board and the group executive. So this isn't just board, this is group executive as well. Risk boundaries for decision making. And this is really responding to one of the issues that other organisations have identified with the bear. The bear is inhibiting decision making. People are just not making decisions, putting things off. So setting some boundaries around that. And then accountability being accompanied by empowerment. Again, it's really resetting, and I think where the CBA report into APRA provides fantastic guidance and has done for the last 2 or 3 years, this sort of reset by WESTPAC will also, I think, have a big impact on the business community in Australia. So we're going to now just spend a little bit of time on some particular non-financial risks. We've talked about these 5 C's earlier, but climate, first of all, we'll look at climate and cyber, and I'll throw to Nicola in a minute. But I just wanted to pick up firstly the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. These recommendations are coming out of a global task force, and they're being picked up particularly by Australian companies in the banking and insurance sector. And so you're seeing these sorts of recommendations, and these are disclosure recommendations, but there are others, guiding lending policies, insurance policies, investment policies for our largest corporations, as well as actual operation that has environmental impact. And so these general themes for disclosure are now being taken up quite broadly, and so another change. But ESG in particular, and what directors should be doing. Nicola, some comments on this? So
ESG has become, you know, it's interesting how quickly things can change. ESG has become, I think, an absolute material focus for boards, led by a couple of things. One is a very well orchestrated number of entities who are pushing companies to do it, and that includes significant investors and people like AXI and the proxy advisors. But secondly, it's also being driven by a recognition that we need to do better in this space right across the board. And thirdly, interestingly, I think employees are demanding that companies take a stand and focus on ESG, and that's certainly the observation I would make from the companies that I'm involved in. And fourthly, then generated by the emergence of the TCFD guidelines, which has been run by the Bank of England, and very financially focused. So, you know, looking at it as a risk and then how it impacts a company. And I think up until TCFD, there was no sort of real theme or measurement that companies could look at to measure their what they were doing in this space. And that's the game changer that I think TCFD has brought. If you go back 3 years, the difference in the TCFD reporting and Australian listed companies are still not regarded as doing well in this space, but are doing really well, doing much better than they were 3 years ago, is looking at their businesses and how they are impacted by climate change and looking at it as a risk. And that's been the game changer. And so that's been, I think, a seminal point in how climate change is now being looked at. And because it's being looked at as a risk, and because there are financial consequences, and also particularly and potentially reputational consequences if you don't get this right, directors are doing the things that you've set out on this slide. And if they're not, they should be.
Thank you. And then the other real focus recently, cyber risk, and Nicola, you've had some particular experiences with this. It's fair to say that ASIC has been seeking, or at least providing some sort of guidance now for 5 years, but it's taken a while.
It has taken a while, and it is complicated. And the reason Tim made his comment is that I've been on 2 boards that have been subject to cyber issues, and I'm an non-executive director of Toll. It is incredibly complicated, and I think so 2 things I wanted to say. One is I think that there is going to be increased regulation on boards in relation to cyber. And you can see that by the pronouncements that the various government, the regulators and the federal government agencies, not only in Australia but overseas, are making in this space. There's been a lot of egregious cyber attacks, and I use the word egregious in that when the root causes are established, companies have not had the proper controls in place to stop a cyber attack. That's the first thing. The second thing is the Australian government is actually very concerned about Australian companies that provide services in critical areas, so infrastructure companies, energy companies, and whether their cybersecurity controls are what they should be. And so I think my own view is that we will see a statutory obligation on boards in relation to cyber, because as you say, Tim, ASIC's been looking at this for 5 years and they're still not satisfied that boards are taking the risk as seriously as they should. I'm not sure that I agree with that. I think it's actually a lot more complicated. And when you look at the toll situation, that was unfortunate, and a lot of it is not to do with the systems; is actually to do with training of people not to accept a phishing attack. So it's a very complicated space. But if boards aren't taking it seriously, they should.
All right, we're now going to move and look at the BEAR, which we've mentioned a few times today, but just to provide a bit of detail in relation to the BEAR. It's the Bank Executive Accountability Regime. It was introduced in 2018 when it started to apply to the 4 major banks and then applied to all other ADIs in the middle of last year. It imposes accountability obligations on all domestic and foreign ADIs supervised by APRA. So multinational banks who have a presence in Australia are also subject to this. And it does create some conflict type issues between regulation elsewhere and regulation under the BEAR. So far, those seem to have been managed reasonably well, but as Nicola mentioned, a bank like Macquarie is subject to the senior manager regime in the UK, is subject to similar regimes elsewhere around the world, in Hong Kong, for instance, and to the BEAR. And sorting that out is a bit difficult. But anyway, I think we're dealing with it in a reasonably effective way. But it has been a major element in this change to accountability expectations of boards and senior managers. Accountable persons under the BEAR are basically all senior managers. Anyone that's got a senior management role is subject to the BEAR. Every member of the board is subject to the BEAR. And then there are specific functions that are called out under BEAR and made accountable. And so those include information and IT, the CIO, internal audit, compliance, human resources, and anti-money laundering. Often a senior executive such as the CFO will pick up more than one of these obligations, but in larger organisations such as the CBA, for instance, you've got 15 accountable people below board level. These obligations are obligations that people in this situation have never had to face before. They haven't been subject to, for instance, the statutory duty of care. And so this is really imposing having a major effect on the management of companies that are subject to it. What are the obligations? The banks themselves have particular obligations, all of which are subject to a reasonable steps qualifier. So reasonable steps to conduct your business, honesty, integrity, due care, skill and diligence, dealing with the APRA in an open and cooperative way, preventing matters arising that would adversely affect prudential standing or prudential reputation, coming back to this reputation point that was raised earlier, and then ensuring that their accountable persons comply. The ADI has to provide an accountability map, which basically identifies every aspect of the operations of the ADI and makes someone accountable for them. So you've got no gaps. The accountability obligations of accountable persons are similar, but interestingly, the obligation to act with honesty, integrity, due care, skill and diligence is not subject to a reasonable steps qualifier, nor is the obligation to deal with APRA in an open, constructive and cooperative way. You do, however, have a qualifier on the obligation to prevent matters that would adversely affect prudential standing or reputation. As we mentioned earlier, where people are jointly accountable for a particular function, and in practical terms, there are functions for which any normal management structure would have joint accountability or matrix accountability, but where you do have joint accountability, there is legal joint liability. So one person stuffs up, the other is responsible. The other major impact of the BEAR is that variable rem must be deferred for 4 years. I think that's almost become standard, in fact. So it really reflects where we've got to. 40% deferred for all accountable people other than the CEO, for whom 60% of variable room gets deferred. So that's the structure. What are the consequences? A bank can be penalised up to $222 million per breach. The federal government increased the penalty rate as of 1 July in the middle of COVID. Slightly odd. Accountable persons have to be registered by APRA, and APRA can disqualify them. So APRA can basically take away your qualification to be a CFO, a CIO, a head of HR, a head of compliance in a bank. Accountable persons cannot be individually penalised under BEAR, but they can be penalised for the same conduct under the Corporations Act, and the maximum penalty for instance, failing to discharge your obligation of care and diligence under the Corporations Act is now 1.11 million per breach. And of course, accountable persons are subject to remuneration adjustments as well. Accountable persons can't be indemnified against these consequences, and nor can D&O insurance be purchased. So this is out and out personal exposure for accountable persons, can't be indemnified and can't be insured. So I'll just stop there. Nicola, any observations on how the BEAR has impacted in areas that you've had experience?
So I think there's been both positive and negative consequences. The positive has been looking at the complexity within organisations and trying to remove the complexity, because that was a big issue in the CBA APRA report, and also it came out in the Financial Services Royal Commission, and also the recent issues that affected Westpac. So removing complexity and making accountability lines, so who is responsible for what, I think has been a positive impact on the way that organisations, the ADIs have looked at their organisations and have removed layers of complexity. So that's been the positive. The negative is this personal liability point, because unlike directors, if you breach your director's duties, you are covered in most circumstances by either an indemnity from the company or D&O insurance, unless you've been egregious. And we all know what that is. It's, in my view, this is an area that will need to change. And correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, I don't think this is in the SMR regime in the UK. So the indemnity point and the insurance point. And this is what executives are struggling with, because you've now got a system. Executives have not been subject to these types of rules except in WHS circumstances, and they're not as so the amount that you can be fined is not as high in those areas. So I think that's an area that needs to be looked at when this system is reviewed, hopefully. And I think isn't it being reviewed if FAR comes in, Tim? So you might pick that up when you talk about FAR. So I think the negative has been, and the other negative has been, it has been stressful for executives who are subject to BEAR. That would be my observation, coming under this regime, and it plays out in different ways through organisations. So there's a lot of work being done at the moment to make sure that people who are accountable then have the right systems below them, the right executive teams below them. And again, that's both a good thing, but I think the stress levels on some of these executives have been enormous, particularly in organisations that have a flatter structure than some of the bigger complex organisations.
So just building on that, Tim and Nicola, there's a question that says there's a suggestion that BEAR in this discussion is inhibiting decision making, and the question is, how could that be addressed?
So I think that's right, Jeffrey. It's a good question, and what goes with that is also it's inhibiting the businesses from operating, because everyone's got their BEAR accountability sitting on their shoulder. I think it needs to be addressed through a review of the system, which I think the government said they would do at some point, and then they'll tweak. I think what we need to do is work out how it's actually working in operations now, and then what's working well and what's not working well. And the inhibiting of business decisions, my observation would be there's more layers that have been inserted into some processes to get decisions made, and that's not optimal either. You've got to try and work out how you can balance those competing priorities.
Yeah, I think ANZ has been particularly vocal about the impact of BEAR on decision making and the inaction that it has created, and the reluctance to make decisions. Unfortunately, I think we're not looking at solving those issues anytime soon. And I'll come to the FAR proposals, which is the FAR replacement for BEAR, in a minute. But Jeffrey, just keeping an eye on the clock, I promise to be finished running through the slides in less than 5 minutes from here. How is all of this being enforced? Well, ASIC is the enforcer, and at the moment, the main route for enforcement is Section 180, subsection 1 of the Corporations Act, which is the obligations on directors and senior executives to discharge their duties with care and diligence. As I mentioned, the civil penalty is now up to 1.1 million per breach, and directors and executives can also be disqualified from managing a corporation. ASIC's developed a strategy which has been termed the stepping stone strategy. And basically this strategy says that if a company breaches the law, if a company breaches its regulatory or legal obligations, then directors and executives can be held accountable for that because they breached their duty of care by permitting that breach to occur or by failing to act reasonably to stop it. And this technique has been developed very successfully over the last 10 years by ASIC. And I've listed there on this slide some recent cases. I do have some slides in relation to each of these, but I'll skip over them and just tell you very briefly the story for each of these 4 cases. For Storm, it was a case of the executive directors, not the NEDs, but the executive directors, being held accountable for providing inappropriate advice to pensioners in Cairns. The situation there was that Storm actually went into liquidation or into administration before these cases were run. Storm itself was never prosecuted for giving advice which breached its obligations under its AFSL, but the 2 executive directors, the Casamatis, were, and they were found liable, were fined a large amount of money and disqualified for 7 years as a result of that. So it's a non-financial risk, giving poor advice. Vocation was a disclosure issue, and the chairman of Vocation, John Dawkins, former Labor government minister, was also fined and disqualified for failing to provide proper disclosure in a capital raising process. The chair, the CEO and the CFO were the subject of proceedings for that non-financial risk, non-disclosure risk, not the other non-executive directors. Mariner is an interesting case of what ASIC alleged to be a reckless takeover announcement. A takeover was announced by Mariner subject to finance. The finance didn't come through. ASIC proceeded anyway, and the court in that case concluded that neither Mariner had breached that obligation of recklessly making a takeover announcement, and nor had the 2 directors involved breached their obligations in relation to that case. And that's one of the rare losses for ASIC in these stepping stones cases. And then the final one, the Australian Wheat Board, AWB, quite notorious, where AWB effectively paid bribes to the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. And the company was never prosecuted. In fact, it successfully challenged a ruling by ATO that the bribes were not tax deductible and got a tax deduction for the bribes. The story is unbelievable. The only people to ever be pinged as a result of that case, after royal commissions and all sorts of things, were two of the executives who entered agreed penalty arrangements with ASIC, and the chairman, Trevor Pfluger, who was finally, after 15 years after the event, into his 70s, was disqualified for 5 years and fined $50,000 for his role. Again, in failing to follow up red flags relating to corrupt conduct within the organisation. So there are 4 examples of ASIC pursuing those obligations. So I'm just going to flick through slides which you can have a look at later. Whoops, sorry. The last thing I wanted to mention was the FAR regime. So the government is proposing to replace BEAR with FAR, the Financial Accountability Regime. They've dropped the executive out of the label for this, because otherwise it would have spelled FEAR, which is probably not the right tone that the government wanted to set. Anyway, the FAR regime has been proposed. It's been deferred because of COVID and will be picked up again in 2021. But there are a number of concerning issues about the proposal, and I suspect that the government has been driven by ASIC, which it becomes the conduct regulator for FAR when it's introduced. The first and most concerning thing is that individual accountable persons will become susceptible to direct penalties under FAR at the level we were talking about, 1.11 million per breach. They're not presently subject to that sort of penalty, but as I said, ASIC can still prosecute them under the Corporations Act. The range of accountabilities has expanded unbelievably, and for superannuation entities, for instance, there are now 28 separate accountabilities that have been identified in the FAR proposal. And I don't know how your regular registered superannuation trustee is going to cope with responding to 28 separate accountabilities when they're run on a shoestring anyway. There are a number of other things that I think are problematic. So the person that runs the remediation function in an organisation becomes an accountable person. This is not the person who is responsible for creating the problem that had to be remediated. This is the person who's responsible for ensuring the remediation gets paid. The person that looks after dispute resolution. So we're getting to the point where we're shooting the messenger, and I really don't think that that is going to create the right sort of response or achieve the success that the government's after. Anyway, on that note, Jeffrey, I'm sorry I stopped screen sharing accidentally, but I'm sure we can cope.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. Look, there are a couple of questions and some comments, so a good time to pause for some discussion before we conclude on the hour. So there's a comment around AWB that AWB may not have been directly impacted, and as you point out, it's amazing that it was, but the Australians Transparency International rating declined as a result. So there are much broader consequences that perhaps often don't get raised in the discussion.
I agree. I think AWB followed by Securency really had a significant impact. Both of those organisations being either government controlled or ex-government controlled, and really did have a big impact on our international rating. I mean, AWB was absolutely a scandal, paying hundreds of millions of dollars of bribes to Saddam Hussein in order to win wheat supply contracts was just extraordinary. But the most extraordinary thing is the only legal proceeding that actually went the full distance was to prosecute the chairman for a breach of his duty of care. That was it.
So a really interesting question here. So based on what has been discussed and described today, how is this impacting on the selection of non-executive directors? And the comments made on some of my reviews, it would appear that the skills that some boards may have may not be sufficient for these changes, i.e. they don't have executive experience to support them?
Nicola, would you like to take that first and I'll follow up?
Sure. So I think I'm not sure that I've seen a visible change in the capability selection. I think boards are, I think one observation I would make is that a lot of executives are making the decision not to become non-executive directors simply because of the liability, and that's particularly in the financial services sector. There's no doubt that there has been an increased focus, particularly over the last 5 years, by investors on board capability. And you're right, when you look across the boards of the ASX 200, they need to have a cross-section of capability to be able to navigate the regulatory requirements that boards now find themselves under. So that's the answer to that question. But a comment I'd like to make, Jeffrey, is that we are in the middle of a complete debate about the role of a director, and what we've talked about today is just one subset of that debate. And so, there's a whole range of issues that are going to that question: what is the proper role of a director? And then to answer the question that was asked, that then goes into what capabilities should directors have. When you look at the mix and the composition of the board, you've got to make sure that you've got people who have the right skills to navigate that particular company's operations and its regulatory requirements.
Nicola, thank you. Tim?
Yeah, I think we're, just to back up what Nicola was saying, firstly, we're seeing much more attention paid to the board skills matrix. Now, this is something that's been encouraged under the ASX corporate governance principles, but we're seeing it really bite, and boards going out and actively seeking to fill capability gaps in the skills matrix. So I think that's been one step that we've observed. I also think that in the broader context, D&O insurance is getting far more expensive. The D&O insurers are increasingly limiting or excluding things from their cover. It's getting harder and harder to have those sorts of protections under insurance, and with more limits, as we've seen under BEAR as an example, of the ability of a company to indemnify directors, even if they're behaving in a completely appropriate manner, but face liabilities for instance, for a failure to cooperate with a regulator, for instance. We are seeing an increase in D&O costs to a point in which they're becoming unaffordable for some companies or some types of cover. And so I do think this really is influencing, as Nicola said, the willingness of well-qualified senior executives with good executive experience to step up into a NED career. Because at the same time as all of those issues with liability and with cover and indemnity are becoming more difficult, the liability is actually increasing. The range of things for which a director is responsible are increasing, and the expectations, both from government and the community, and then from the regulators as to responsibilities of the directors and senior managers are increasing at the same time. So we've got this sort of real tension. I do think it's going to have, if it's not addressed, in particular if the D&O issues are not addressed, we are going to see a dumbing down of the quality of our boards.
Mm. Thank you for that passionate response from both of you. Appreciate it. So look, we're getting very close to time to conclude the top of the hour. So Nicola, can I just ask for any concluding remarks from yourself?
Look, I think this is an interesting topic, and it just demonstrates the comment that I made about the change in the role of directors, and we've seen it visibly in this space, in the management of non-financial risk, and how that's playing out in how boards operate. Looking end to end around how they operate as a board, how boards relate to management, and then how issues percolate up to the board, and then reframing what boards should be looking at. So, and we've seen that in a fairly short amount of time. It's 3 years. And so there has been in my view, a substantial shift in the way that boards are operating as a result of the Financial Services Commission CBA report, the APRA report into the CBA, the issues surrounding Westpac, and it's not only financial services boards, it's boards right across the board.
Nicola, thank you so much. Thank you. Tim, concluding remarks?
Yes, I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things that Nicola mentioned. The examples that we've given and the experience that we've had over the last 3 years have really focused on financial services, but the impact is far, far broader. And so we're seeing now ASIC turn its attention into resources companies, retail sector, media sector, and these things will come. The government has said that the next step with the accountability regimes, once FAR is introduced, which is affecting all APRA-regulated entities, is to move into any entity with an AFSL. And the FAR legislation proposals would enable the government to do that without going back to Parliament. It would have the power under FAR to just extend that regime. So this has all been about accountability. Accountability is coming right across the corporate sector in Australia. Can I just encourage people who are participating in this discussion to think about it, if you haven't had to face these challenges yet, to start preparing. But also, when the government comes out and consults on FAR early in 2021, please, the more response we get from the corporate community to ensure a sensible result, the better. Thanks, Jeffrey.
So thank you so much. So Nicola and Tim, I genuinely feel privileged and want to thank you for being part of this discussion. We could go on for the next another 90 minutes, but we can't, unfortunately. The good news is we can continue this discussion in November when we run the colloquium. And every time I'm involved in these discussions, Tim and Nicola, with you, I feel that I learn so much and gain so much knowledge, and I'm very grateful to both of you for carving out time from your exceptionally busy schedules to share your experience, and not just theoretical experience, but lived experience in this space, both from a legal perspective and a director's perspective. So thank you both so much. Really enjoyed the discussion, enjoyed the engagement, and I'll just put up the concluding slide for those of you who are interested in participating further in these discussions. Colloquium, we'd be delighted for you to take part. If you'll see on the screen the email address of Michael Hall at AGSM. Please feel free to drop Michael an email, and we'd love to have you as part of the colloquium. It'll be held 2 days with a gap, and then 2 days in November. Fingers crossed. Hopefully face-to-face or in a blended format.